Like all good things in the English-speaking union and in bottles of wine, the best is always left to the last. It is with great pleasure that I welcome my colleague that I've known more or less for the last 40 plus years, Christopher Jefferies, who's going to come and talk to us about his extraordinary experience. Christopher.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening. I probably ought to say, just by way of a brief introduction, that when Tony first asked me to give this talk, which must be just over a year ago now, he suggested very much as a working title, My Story. And I'm certainly going to talk about the way in which my arrest was covered by the press. But I want to do that within the wider context of the whole debate about the culture, practices and ethics of the press, and indeed self-regulation. So, I'd like to begin with a couple of quotations. The first is attributed to Hugh Cudlip, the former editor-in-chief of the Mirror Group, who died 15 years ago. The job of a tabloid newspaper, he's reported as saying, is to make the important interesting. The second quotation is attributed to Kelvin Mackenzie, the former editor of The Sun. Ethics? That's a county east of London, isn't it? And while we're about it, here's a third. Privacy is for paedophiles. That's Paul McMullen, the former deputy features editor at the News of the World, giving evidence to the Leveson Enquiry in November 2011. Now, someone who knows at first hand what goes on in tabloid newsrooms is Richard Pepiat, a former journalist on the Daily Star. Some of you may remember his name because of his very public resignation 3 years ago in protest at what he saw as that newspaper's values, or rather lack of them. Since then, he's become something of a scourge of the tabloids. Like many journalists, he started out at a very young age as quite an idealistic reporter on a national newspaper, thinking, as he says himself, that he was going to change the world. But then, after about 2 years working for the Daily Star, he came to the conclusion that, far from doing anything worthwhile, he was wasting his life actively making the world a worse place. And that's what led to his publishing in The Guardian the letter of resignation he wrote to Richard Desmond, the Star's owner. Just as one example of the sort of practices rife among the tabloids, he tells the story of an assignment he was given where he had to sit on the doorstep of a Chelsea mansion where an asylum seeker was supposed to be living with his family and get some quotes for an article. Well, you can imagine the sort of article it was going to be. There was also a reporter from The Sun there and various photographers. And they all waited for 2 days, and during that time, no one entered or left the house. So eventually, at the end of the second day, the news editors at both papers said, "Knock it on the head, come back to the office." The next day, The Sun published a story including 3 lines of reported quotations from the asylum seeker saying, "I don't care about your British system, I'll take what I can get," or words to that effect. Of course, Richard Pepiat's reaction was, "What's all this? I was there all day. This never happened." And the news editor turned to him and said, "Boy, you've got to be a bit more canny. After all, the asylum seeker, if he existed, wasn't going to complain. He quite probably didn't even read English. And it made a big story in The Sun. And it made Richard Peppiatt realise the sort of world he'd entered. When you're asked to deliver something to the news desk, you deliver it. And if you can't find it, you make it up. Well, that story, I think, suggests what much that passes for journalism in this country is all about. It isn't really journalism at all, but a rather debased form of entertainment. All too often, newspapers are there not to tell the truth or inform people's minds. They're there simply to have a visceral impact, which is one of the reasons attention-grabbing headlines often bear little or no relation to the facts of the story. They're simply designed to boost circulation, making money by manufacturing something people can be induced to buy. And if they succeed, that's justification enough. So, to go back to that quotation from Hugh Cudlipp, the days of tabloid public interest journalism, as he would have understood it, making the important interesting, are long gone. And it's a moot point how far even some of the broadsheets are committed to serious investigative public interest reporting. Here's a little bit more from Paul McMullen's evidence to the Leveson Enquiry when he was asked by David Barr whether what appeared in the news of the world was in the public interest. This was his reply. Yes, it's always in the public interest. I see no distinction between what the public is interested in and the public interest. What is of interest to the public is what they put their hand in their pocket and buy. We simply mirrored back what they wanted to read. In his inquiry report, Lord Justice Leveson's comment on the speciousness of this logic included the following. The story about Mr. Jefferies is a prime example of why the elision of the public interest with what interests the public is dangerous. It may well interest the public to read private, scandalous and defamatory material about a suspect to a murder, but it is clearly not in the wider public interest for newspapers erroneously to destroy a man's reputation, let alone to act in contempt of court. It's a perfect demonstration of what Hugh Cudlipp himself saw happening in the 1980s, and which he described as the dawn of the dark ages of tabloid journalism, when the proprietors and editors, not all but most, decided that playing a continuing role in public enlightenment was no longer the business of the popular press. Information about foreign affairs, for example, was relegated to a 3-inch yapping editorial insulting foreigners. So it comes as no surprise, and this is another Richard Peppiatt anecdote, that on the day in the spring of 2011 when thousands took to the streets in Egypt to demand freedom and the removal of President Mubarak, the Daily Star's front page read, "Jordan, the movie." And that wasn't a reference to the Middle East. Hugh Cudlipp's despairing conclusion was that, so far as the popular press was concerned, investigative journalism had shed its integrity and become intrusive journalism for the prurient, where nothing, however personal, was any longer secret or sacred, and the basic human right to privacy had been banished in the interest of publishing profit. Or, as Lord Fowler has more recently put it in a debate in the House of Lords on the Leveson report, what do they, by which he meant large sections of the press, believe in? When making money is the primary goal, it tends to subsume all others. Now, the sort of newspaper coverage my arrest on suspicion of Jo Yeates's murder attracted provides, I think, quite a good example of what I want to go on to talk a little more about. It's certainly true that the whole affair turned out to be something of a gift to the tabloids, a kind of ready-made murder mystery set in this leafy and apparently respectable suburb of Clifton. And it's perhaps interesting to think first of the way in which the figure at the centre of this drama was presented, the tragic victim, Jo Yeates herself. She was young, she was quite attractive, she was vulnerable, she was home-loving, she was at the start of what promised to be an extremely successful career as a landscape architect, and she was just about to spend her first Christmas with her boyfriend. In effect, she was everybody's favourite daughter. They were everyone's ideal couple. And all of this was suddenly destroyed, and her body was found, you'll remember, on Christmas Day of all days, callously dumped by the side of the road. So, evidently we're looking for a depraved monster responsible for all this, and I'm the one who's been arrested. And immediately certain sections of the press were determined to believe that the person who had been arrested was the genuine murderer, and so to portray me in as dark and as lurid a light as possible. And the first thing that happened was that somebody remembered that 30-odd years previously there'd been an unsolved murder of another young girl less than a quarter of a mile away from where Jo had been living. And of course, I had also been living in the area at that time. So, there was quite a bit of excitement that perhaps not just a murderer had been discovered, but someone who was a serial murderer. And in fact, much later, I was rung up by someone I didn't know to say he'd overheard at the time I was in custody a couple of journalists speculating that it was very likely they'd unmasked a serial killer. And then it seemed quite possible, and in the end this did turn out to be absolutely true, that there was a sexual motive for the murder. Now, if you're a reporter who's interested first and foremost in a sensational story that will sell copies, perhaps you'll talk to 100 people, and if 99 of them say one thing, but the 100th, perhaps because you've offered money, says what you want to hear, that's what you're going to go with. Otherwise, as in Richard Pepiat's example, you fabricate something. And two anonymous people, who also, I think, conveniently no longer lived in Bristol, were quoted who had apparently suffered some sexual harassment and who insisted I was the person guilty of that harassment. You won't be surprised that at the end of January this year, the former News of the World reporter Dan Evans, giving evidence at the phone hacking trial, said, "It might come as a shock to the court, but not everything in a tabloid newspaper was what he described as the nailed-on truth, and that he would routinely try to devise plausible-sounding quotes that were likely to escape legal action." But in my case, the tabloids weren't content with simple sexual harassment. Just to be a straightforward sexual predator, that's perhaps not quite spicy enough. So somebody managed to dig up the most tenuous connection imaginable between me and someone who had been imprisoned several years earlier for an offence with an underage boy. Of course, the papers stressed there was no evidence I'd been involved in the offence. But simply by saying there was no evidence, they raised the possibility that I did actually have paedophile tendencies. So we don't just have a sexual predator, we have a bisexual predator. And all sorts of fantastic rumours were latched onto that I would apparently hold pupils' hands while reading poetry. Again, obviously with sinister sexual motives. And then, to complete the character assassination, it was alleged that I was fascinated by death, in fact obsessed with death. What were the grounds for that? Simply that I happened to have shown on occasion a particularly important documentary about the liberation of Auschwitz, which also just happens to be one of the most important films to come out of the Second World War, and is one of the finest documentaries ever made. In fact, when it was released in 1955, the French film director François Truffaut described it as, quite simply, the greatest film ever made. So, this is the person you're listening to at the moment, this dark, macabre, sinister villain. And that wasn't the whole of it. There were all sorts of other things. For example, I was almost certainly prone to violent and uncontrollable outbursts of temper. It's also interesting to think of the epithets that were used to describe, on the one hand, Jo and me on the other. Jo was always the landscape architect, as if to reinforce her respectable credentials and to underline the fact that her career had been cut tragically short. Whereas the caricature of me was of a lewd figure. Peeping Tom was a repeated phrase because I apparently spied on tenants, and a loner simply because I happened to live on my own. To be fair, the papers didn't entirely ignore the fact that a lot of people actually said some quite nice things about me, although these tended to be played down and certainly weren't given much prominence in the articles. Here are just a couple of paragraphs from what Brian Cathcart, who is Professor of Journalism at Kingston University, wrote in an article in the Financial Times Weekend magazine. He said, "This hostile evidence was founded almost entirely on unnamed witnesses, with some of the most contentious quotations reproduced in several papers. A careful reader who relied only on quotes from people who were identified by name would probably have seen a very different picture. A former tenant, a friend, a former headmaster at Clifton College, a neighbour, described in various papers, though usually towards the end of articles, a man who was a dedicated teacher, a responsible landlord, and an active member of his community. Several expressed amazement at his arrest or downright disbelief at the idea of his killing anyone. Put these together with some readily available facts, and it would have been possible to flip the picture entirely. This man had taught for 34 years without a blemish on his record. He was involved in Neighbourhood Watch, the Liberal Democratic Party, and a number of conservation campaigns. He had a large circle of friends, owned a handful of properties, and was studying for a degree in French. As one neighbour put it, he was a pillar of society. But editors did not give prominence to that interpretation. Instead, the papers were so engrossed in their witch hunt that they were even prepared to ignore the warnings about contempt of court from the Attorney General. And, of course, as I mentioned a few moments ago in the quotation from Lord Justice Leveson, two of them, the Sun and the Daily Mirror, were subsequently convicted of contempt and fined.
It is very nice of you to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.